Why was Jesus still wounded after the resurrection? Was it symbolic? Should we expect to be younger and without injury or tattoos and we are resurrected? This is a great question. The wounds that we receive during our life are not eradicated, but they are transformed in the world to come. Here's an example of how this dynamic plays out in the economy of God. When I've talked about this before, when Simeon and Levi murdered the Shechemites in Genesis 34, who had chosen to embrace the Abrahamic covenant, they had been circumcised, and so they were unable to defend themselves because you can't really defend yourself after being circumcised. The first few days afterwards, they went and they slaughtered all the men. Jacob curses them, and he curses them by saying they will not have an inheritance with the people of Israel. So that curse is never revoked. Simeon and Levi, their tribes do not have an inheritance in Israel. But the very structure, that pattern of the curse, which is imposed upon them, can be turned into the shape of its blessing. The very shape, which is the ugliness of something, can be transfigured in such a way that the shape is retained, and yet it becomes its beauty rather than its ugliness. Here's one way how. Exodus 32. Levi is the tribe which executes the ringleaders of the Golden Calf Project. So in Genesis 34, they unlawfully murdered in violence the Shechemites. In Exodus 32, it was out of piety that they executed the ringleaders of the group which sought to bring about apostasy in Israel. And so in Deuteronomy, we are told Levi does not have a specific slice of land in Israel, which is their inheritance. That's the curse. But it becomes a blessing because the Lord himself is the inheritance. Because they teach the entire nation about the God of Israel. And I would say that this helps explain the wounds that are on Jesus after the resurrection. Now, in the Gospels, we are told repeatedly that there's something different about Jesus. All the language that we use is based on prior experience, right? So there are certain colors which we do not have a word for, and thus we cannot see them. We know that there are certain other people groups who can see colors that are different than the ones that we see. There are certain people groups who cannot distinguish deep blue from green when you just show them. But yet, what looks to us as 12 identical greens, they can distinguish different colors in them. And so there's this interpenetration between our history of experience with particular kinds of qualities and having words for those things. Now, the resurrection body is a new kind of existence. It's a new kind of corporeality. So the Gospels are written in Greek. And the Greek language is developed to describe and in the context of the old world. And so it's very difficult to identify precisely what makes the resurrection body different. So we're told things like they did not recognize him until they partook of the Eucharist. That's what happens on the road to Emmaus. On the road to Emmaus, they do not recognize Jesus, and then Jesus broke bread and gave it to them. That means it's the Eucharist. That's Eucharistic terminology. He broke bread, gave it to them. Their eyes were opened. That is an echo of Genesis 3, where the eyes of Adam and Eve were opened when they took of the tree of knowledge. Well, the Eucharist we take lawfully of the incarnate Logos, whereas the tree of knowledge was taken before it was permitted. It was taken unlawfully. And then they saw that it was the Lord. Actually, this is part of a major theme in Luke and Acts of things which happen on roads. Think about the Ethiopian eunuch. He meets Philip on the road, and then Philip is swept up in the Spirit after he interprets the scriptures for the Ethiopian eunuch, just as Jesus interpreted the scriptures for the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. And then Jesus disappeared from their sight, just as Philip is swept up by the Spirit and taken away. Paul is on the road to Damascus. Paul sees on the road to Damascus a vision of the resurrected Lord who shows him that he is the Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament. And then Paul's eyes are blinded. This is all a riff on this theme of travel, the gift of the Spirit, illumination, and so forth. In the Gospel of John, we're told that when Jesus gave them breakfast, again, Eucharistic theme, this is not the Eucharist, but he took bread, gave it to them. We're told that he cooked bread and fish over a fire. This charcoal fire is the only other charcoal fire in John besides the charcoal fire where Peter denied Jesus. Fires gather people together. People will naturally congregate around a fire when it's cold. Fires unify people together. They are the liturgical and social center of a particular kind of body politic. That's why you couldn't kindle fire on the Sabbath in the Old Testament law, because God was kindling his fire, the fire on the altar, twice as much, because there were double sacrifices on the Sabbath day. Anyway, just as Peter denied Jesus 3 times, Jesus restores Peter 3 times around a charcoal fire. So we have the sacramental terminology being linked with the Eucharist, bread and fish. Well, that corresponds to Israel and the nations, because the nations correspond to the sea. The people of Israel correspond to the land. We see this, for example, in Daniel, where the Gentile nations rise out of the sea. We see it in Jonah, where Jonah goes to a place he could get to through land, but he goes to it through a fish. We see it in many other biblical texts. And Jesus feeds the 5,000 with bread and fish, and he feeds the 4,000 bread and fish. Well, the 4,000 are Gentiles, the 5,000 are Jews. Jesus later draws significance to the fact that the 4,000 are fed with 7 leftover baskets, the 5,000 12 leftover baskets. 7 corresponds to the number of the nations, because nations, 70 nations. Ezekiel refers to 7 peoples who are conquered by the Messianic kingdom, and 12 tribes of Israel. This refers obviously to Israel. So Jesus in the feedings feeds not only both Israel and the nations, but he feeds both Israel and the nations with things which symbolically correspond to Israel and the nations. So the one church is realized as one church because in partaking of Christ, they also partake of each other. The marriage supper of the Lamb unites not only us to our bridegroom, but us to each other. That is why marriages are associated with feasts, because in becoming one flesh, if you are what you eat, when you eat the same food, you're being joined into one flesh. And it shows that in marriage, not only 2 individuals are joined together, but those 2 individuals become conduits whereby their families are linked together. And these threads create interrelationships through time, which bind a society and a people together. I think that's one reason why an extended family should be given more importance than we're used to giving it today. Anyway, just pointing out the Eucharistic themes in these resurrection appearances of Jesus. It said in John 20, none of them dared to ask, "Who are you?" for they knew it was the Lord. Well, that's such a strange thing to say, because they'd known this guy for 3 years. There was something different about Jesus. But there was not existing language to describe the nature of that difference. So, yes, Jesus still had his wounds in his glorified body. We do not know what those wounds looked like. I do not think that there was language available to them which would have allowed them to communicate what those wounds looked like. When people have visions of the world to come, saints, when they have visions of the world to come, sometimes they will describe colors which they cannot remember afterwards, but except to say that there were different colors than they had had any experience with. So I think this has to do with the fact that in the Lord, even those things which had been our curse, even if they were punishments, can become the shape of the blessings that are given to us.